This review is brought to you in part by Rogers Hobby Center in Saginaw, Michigan, where the fun begins. Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the Paddy Wagon by Tom Daniel. It's a 124 scale monogram model kit number 85-4194. It was a skill level 3 kit for the advanced builder, and standing the test of time, this iconic kit was first released in '68 and then re-released in 2013. It's out of production now, but can still be found in the online auctions and at a lot of larger hobby shops. The model consists of 88 parts, 4 generic vinyl tires, 2 slicks for the backup, and 2 treaded tires for the front. Now the kit's molded in dark blue, gold-plated parts and clear pieces with water slide decals. This release looks pretty good too. There's no heavy flash, and the gold-plated parts are bright and clear, and it's not too heavy. Now the body and chassis were straight, and crisp mold lines make this a nicely detailed kit. Now it also comes with 2 pre-decorated police officer characters in this version, and it measures about 7 inches long, 3 1/4 inches wide, and 3 3/4 inches high when finished. Here are the contents of the kit, and I'm not going to bore you by picking up each piece and sprue and try and describe them. I'm going to show you how to build the kit. Now we'll be using Model Master liquid cement for most of the construction, white glue for the clear parts, and super glue for some fragile components. The decals are nice and crisp and clear, but I do suggest you use some of the setting solutions available on the aftermarket. And always follow the recommended safety and use guidelines from the manufacturers of any of the products that you see or hear used in the review. The first thing that I did was gather up all the pieces that are going to be painted body color, and I just left them on the trees for good coverage, both front and back sides, and remove the parts that are not going to be painted blue. The reason for this, to paint them even though it's molded in color, is there are swirls in the plastic that you just can't avoid when you're injecting molds. So we're going to give them a coat of, after we wash them up, we're going to give them a coat of good etching primer, and then we're going to paint them with some of that medium blue paint by Duplicolor, and make sure, of course, that they're thoroughly dried, and set them aside for later. Now the seats in the vehicle basically look like park bench seats made out of wood. So we're going to gather these materials. As you see, some acrylic paint here and some wood finish and a broad brush. And we're going to paint them with 2 light coats of a light camel brown craft paint, and then allow about a half an hour between coats, and then let them dry completely for a couple of hours. With the base coat dried, it's time to use the stain pen, and you may want to practice this a little bit on some plastic material before you work with the seats, but it takes a little practice, and you get a pretty nice grain, wood grain look just by brushing it over the base wood coat, intentionally leaving some stroke marks, and in places you just dab it a little harder to make it look like a knot or a feature in the wood. Now between the brush marks and the craft paint and the strokes, it gives it a texture that can look kind of like wood, so it makes for a nice appearance. I used basically the same technique to finish the floor in the unit. The padded sidewalls of the containment box there are also painted to simulate a leather padding, only a lighter touch with the stain pen was used so that you don't really have strokes, but more or less just features. Now it takes a little practice, and they're all allowed to dry completely overnight. Now we can start working with the engine. It has some headers on it, and they'll need to be cleaned up a little bit. There's some minor flash on the parting line edges, and the 2 main blocks with the transmission attached. I actually didn't paint the model because the color was pretty nice the way it was, and and I would have painted it a semi-gloss black anyway had this been built for a contest model. But clean that up and assemble the two halves. Locate the rest of the engine parts as you see here, and some of them of course have the gold plating on them. And there's two snorkel ram scoops that sit on top of the engine, and there are some sink marks in there that if you're going to make this once again for contest, you'll want to fill those first and then smooth them over before you paint. The engine block has a little rise where the seam comes across, so in order for the valley cover there to fit properly, you'll want to sand that flat and get rid of that rise. The engine will assemble fairly easily, and it really looks interesting when you're done. I had painted the headers flat white and let those dry before assembly, but everything went together pretty well, and you may need to do a little clean out around the cross headers to fit inside of the header covers there. But once that's done and everything is glued, set that aside to dry. Now make sure of course that you remove any plating or paint for that matter from any of the joints that you want to glue together to get a good bond. Glue won't stick to plating or paint very well. So fit that into the engine chassis mounts, and they're very clear location points on the directions and on the model. So once again, remove the glue and make sure that that is properly aligned and is vertical in the chassis. Now we'll remove a little bit of paint in the area where the rear step is installed, and that goes into position very nicely. The location points are great. Once again, the chrome has to be scraped off when you're installing the braces there for the step 2. So gather up the parts now for the rear axle, and painted the springs flat black. Let those dry, and then go ahead and assemble the rear end pumpkin there with the springs, and they all go together very well. Just remember to scrape off the chrome where you glue pieces together. I used a little slow setting tube glue here to install the rear end into position, and the reason for that is to make sure that you can adjust everything and align it properly so that it dries in position in the right place. Now we're going to work with the two ornate radius rods here for the front end, and they're very fragile, so you'll have to use some fine snips to make sure that you clip those off without breaking them. And then test fit where those go together up front there, and as you can see, and then make sure that you carefully scrape any of the plating off so that they can be properly glued into position, and they go right together where they should, so add those now. And now we can add the plated tie rod there, that's the horizontal rod, to the front axle, and it goes right into place. Just make sure you scrape the plating before you glue it. Now we can add those front fenders, and the first one of course will go right into position, but I would use some slow setting glue because you're going to want to make sure there is symmetry between this one and the other fender, and that's going to take a little bit of positioning. So make sure that your glue is a little tacky, and then set these into place and keep them into position until they start to set. Let them dry thoroughly. Next we'll work on the wheels, and of course the tires are pretty cool, and their wheels are fairly basic assembly with fronts and backs, and with the wheel hubs on the insides of course, and you'll need to put a little pressure on the backings plates to get them into the front rims, but go ahead and put those together and scuff up the tread areas a little bit so they look more natural. Once those are set, you can snap those wheels onto the hubs, and they actually snap right on with just a little pressure and remain remarkably straight and true, so it was well engineered. Well, now we're at the point where we have a rolling chassis, and I wish all model kits and rolling chassis went together this well and properly. It looks great. The gold plating really stands out, and now we're all set to build the rest of the model on our chassis. firewall and the dashboard are assembled, but before that we added a little detailing to the dashboard. We blacked out the panel here, as you can see, and then the dials were painted with a silver Sharpie, and then the little dial indicators, the needles, were painted with a red marker, a small red marker to indicate dials and gauges. The front panel on the containment box has a couple of louvers or vents in the front end there, and I elected to use some of the gold colored bare metal foil product and cover those up and smooth it down to give that a nice gold tinted look. And then there are some silver bars that go onto the box, the sides and the front, and those were simply painted with little chrome paint to give them the appearance of bars on the windows. The seat risers were painted flat black. They're brackets that go under the seats, and once those are dry, they were put into place in the position, and they go there easily with good placement, and they line up excellently with the bench seat there. So go ahead and install those now. Now we'll install the bench seat. Now the directions will have you put the seat in after the front body panels installed, but it's really easier to line the seat up with the brackets first. Otherwise the panel kind of gets in your way for viewing to fit that into position correctly. So the front body panel gets installed then after the seat is put in. Because of the way the Paddy Wagon is constructed, I elected to install the decals at this time prior to assembly. The thing is, they look great, but you need to use plenty of water in order to make sure that you can position them, especially the small pinstripes, to make sure that they go into place properly. Then just swab them off to make sure that you get any trapped water or air bubbles out of them. And you may find some setting solutions like Microset will help to put them in position to stay. Once those dry overnight, you can give the decals and the paint panels there a clear coat to seal them into position. Then once again, we're going to let those dry thoroughly before we install them to the body. Now here's probably one of the more difficult parts of the kit, and that is installing and aligning the body panels there. They're a little challenging, and test fitting will be the rule here, and you may need to do some sanding to make sure that everything fits together just right. Once the gluing points are determined, of course, you need to scrape the paint for a good solid joint. So put in the front panel, and then after that we'll add the side panels into place. Now everything will line up if you make sure there's no flash or ridges to get into the way of each other. And once again, test fitting will be the key. Now if the side panels are on straight and square, then the smaller rear back panels will fit perfectly. So put those into the test fitting here as you're placing the side panels into position. Everything went together very well, surprisingly, so it's a pretty well engineered kit. Now we're going to install the plated shifter, and then the steering column and wheel were painted flat black, and then they were located and glued into position. Now gather the parts for the lights in the front radiator and grille, and they go together with the headlights in position and a temperature gauge, and again you have to remove a little bit of the plating in order to glue those. Now of course, doing that and even removing these parts from the sprue tree, you're going to remove a little bit of that gold plating, and it's pretty obvious, so I just used a little gold paint from a bottle paint there to touch up those areas and let them dry before trying to glue these together. Now to give the grill a little detail, I gave it a black wash. That's 50-50 thinned paint and flat black into the radiator area, and it also brings out some of the highlights on the grill too. So scrape the glue from the bottom there and go ahead and fit that into the frame. cross member, and it fits just right. So glue it into position, make sure that it sits properly, and then you can add the front mustache trim there, the gold rail, into position, and it looks pretty neat. The roof was painted flat black and allowed to dry, and then glued into position. And oh, by the way, this needs to be part of the test fitting for your side panels to make sure that everything fits together and properly. When you're done, there's a small ridge that runs along the underside of the roof to fit it to the body panels. And you'll just glue with some that ridge with some sparing glue along those edges, and make sure everything is square and it fits well. Now you can see in the directions here that the windshield is glued into that opening area, and then the supports are added to it, but these are not really well indicated. So you're going to have to study the areas around where they would be glued into position and test fit them to make sure that you get a good location. Now the supports go under the headlights, as you see the circle here, the circles, and then into a small groove there, and attached to the windshield at two really tiny raised pins on the glass. Now, at first glance, these look like flashing, but they belong there, so don't remove them from the window. Just take your time and apply those with a small amount of glue and put them into position. Once again, these are very small and fragile parts. You can see the handrails and the brake lever here will be added, but you'll need to handle those very carefully and make sure that you've got a place for them to drop if you after you let go, so that you can recover them. So the brake lever and the side handrails there, the horn and the horn cover, will go into position. Just fit them, scrape off a little glue, and the location points are pretty clear, but you will need to drill those out for the rails a little bit to make sure you get a good clean fit. So put those into position. So the rear handrails are also very fragile, and along with the decals, that's what really makes this a skill level kit for the advanced builder. So use a lot of caution even when removing them from the sprue. Make sure that you don't break them. And there's some clear locations for these rear panel rails and steps, and just use some tube glue and let it tack before putting them into position, so that you can align everything and make sure it sets up properly. Now the final pieces are the lamp globes on each side of the opening. We're going to add those at this time, and of course be careful with the plating. First, I painted the globes white, of course, and then added the police decal. Once that's dry, you can glue that to the bracket, and then scrape the plating and glue the bracket to the openings. It's a very smooth and proper opening there, so go ahead and put those into position. Well, there you have it. Now we can add the pre-decorated officers Fogarty and O'Reilly to the scene here, and the driver here seated in front. It didn't want to fit into the seat behind the wheel. I'm not sure what kind of adjustments would be made for that. So we put him on a spare helmet. But obviously, with Billy Club in hand, the city is in good hands with the officers on duty. Now, this kit is excellent shelf and display material. However, it takes a little difficulty aligning up that box and getting the decals and fragile pieces into place. So it's not for the novice builder. It's going to take a considerable amount of patience to make sure this kit goes together well. Test fitting will be the rule here, and there's a lot of tedious scraping of the paint and plating in order to make sure the parts have good bonds. But when you're done, it's an excellent display, and Tom Daniel's designs are some of my favorites, and I think that you'll love this kit if you put one together and take some time and patience. It could be detailed for a considerable amount of extra authenticity, but once you're done, I think you're going to be very pleased. So if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you liked this premium step-by-step model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can find us on Facebook and our website right on replicas.com. Thanks!